Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by WebHealer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. WebHealer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, WebHealer specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the WebHealer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, WebHealer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 370 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and today I'm joined by Wright and Lisa Smith from Neddy Training. Bernie and Lisa are here to talk about a presentation that is still not widely recognised but is becoming important for counsellors and those working with children and families. I'm speaking of ARFID, or Avoidant, Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. ARFID is a condition that can be often linked with neurodivergence, and it may present as extreme food avoidance, sensory sensitivities, or intense anxiety around eating. For many parents and carers, this can be both confusing and deeply worrying, particularly when they are trying to understand what is driving their child's eating behaviours. In this episode, Bernie and Lisa explore what ARFID is, how it presents in practice, and why it is so important for practitioners to recognise the difference between fussy eating and a clinically significant eating difficulty. They also share insights from their latest lecture, produced for the Counsellor CPD Library, which provides a practical and accessible guide for therapists wanting to understand and work more effectively with ARFID. So with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 370 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly. Rory and I are going to be guiding you through 3 stops on today's journey, starting off with ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about grounding techniques that every counsellor should know. We then go into Practice Matters. Rory has already introduced that interview with Lisa Smith and Bernie Wright on Avoidant, Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. This is part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1, go listen to that because it's well worth it. And then in Student Services, recognizing you, students on your formal journey, we're going to be speaking about finding your first supervisor. That takes me back, Rory. It really does. Without any further ado, straight into ethical, sustainable practice, grounding techniques, what every counsellor should know. And I'm going to start off by asking Rory, what is a grounding technique and when is it necessary?
Well, for a long time, we've known that therapy takes place in the here and now. So, when I mean the here and now, I absolutely mean equal and present time. So the person who is the client is in the therapy room and they are aware that they're in the therapy room. They're aware of, what day it is. They're aware of their chronological age. They are, to all intents and purposes, present. And what can happen, certainly in times where clients are speaking about things that are difficult, things that may have happened in the past, they can withdraw to the past. They can, if you like, enter a place that isn't in the here and now. And they can enter a place which, with all the fears, all the powerlessness, all the terror of what happened to them. Once the client's in that space, it can be quite hard for them to come back to the reality. And I think that's why it's so important for therapists to understand that if this happens, a grounding technique to bring the client back to the here and now and to safety is so important. So that is why I think every therapist needs to use grounding techniques when appropriate.
Yes, beautifully introduced, Rory. And you've mentioned there, I mean, we're venturing into trauma-informed therapy as we talk about grounding techniques here. And you're 100% right. And I think each one of us can relate to a time, and I encourage you as the listener to have a think about a time when you yourself may have been caught up in the past, what you said, what happened, what you did. Now, we're not speaking trauma responses here, but we're just showing how easy it is to slip into the past and what kind of feelings can come up in the here and now while your head is in the there and then. And as you beautifully introduced, Rory, therapy takes place in the here and now, both present within the relationship. So if a client is in the there and then, they might have been triggered by something or transported back almost to a time that was particularly traumatic for them. They may be feeling the emotions of that there and then. Their mind may be racing and experiencing the thoughts of the there and then. And we might perceive this and see that this client is distressed. And a grounding technique is a way of inviting that client back into the here and now with their emotions and with their thinking, and it can bring relief, Rory.
Yeah, it can. And, as I say at the end of every podcast, stay grounded and stay safe. And that's really the essential, I think, in the therapy room of clients feeling that they're grounded in the therapy room, that they know exactly where they are, they're sharing equal and present time, and that they feel at some level safe. Therapy may not feel safe because of what's being discussed, but there is safety implicit within the therapeutic environment. In other words, they know that they're with a therapist, they're free from harm, and they're not in the past. And I think what can happen is that clients can talk about what's going on for them. And in some cases, and when you become a more experienced therapist, you can see this process starting to take place. They start to drift away. And what might happen is clients may become a little disconnected. They may their voices may change. They may be speaking from a more sort of childish voice, or a voice they would have had where the trauma occurred. And I think sometimes it's really helpful for a therapist to sort of say, okay, I can see that you look like you're in a little bit of distress here. Perhaps we could do some work just to bring you back, just to help you feel a little bit more secure. How would that sound? And most clients would say yes. So you could use things like distraction and attention shifting. So if a client is completely lost in what's happened in the past, you could talk about neutral topics such as the weather or hobbies or daily routine. And I can't say enough about the ordinary, Ken, because with all the techniques that we can find ourselves at our disposal, all the trauma-informed techniques, a lot of trauma specialists say that actually sometimes just talking to the clients about the day-to-day is a real help in stabilizing them and keeping them into the here and now. And you could ask them to describe maybe a favorite place that they like, where they love or they feel safe, maybe naming objects in a room. And in some cases, and it's not one I would use personally, but doing a simple mental task such as counting backwards or listing items in a category. I think I would struggle counting backwards because of my dyslexia.
So would I.
And listing items in a category does sound a little like school, doesn't it? But the whole point is just to is just to bring the client back into the here and now, because, and this is the takeaway, you cannot do any effective work with a client if they're experiencing in-room panic or in-room trauma, because the part of the brain that does the work is now nulled to some extent, and the part of the brain that's in fight or flight is in full operation, and you just cannot do any work that's helpful here. All we can do is try and stabilise the client and bring them, into the here and now.
Yeah, beautifully said. I love that you started with the distraction and attention shifting as a technique. And we are going to go into some other grounding techniques as well. But I think, as you said, Rory, you cannot underestimate the power of the ordinary, just the person being distracted from that line of thought. And it is, you've explained it, Rory, this is happening in the brain. And as soon as the brain starts experiencing those memories, creating those emotions, it's going back in time, hormones and chemicals are produced that are really uncomfortable. And I guess we can all relate to them at some level, the kind of feelings that come up within the body. So the trick here is distracting the brain, gaining the attention of the brain. And you can throw in little things like, just how did you get here today? Did you come in your car, or was that on the bus, or did you walk? And it may seem totally out of sorts of that you'd be throwing that in, but in order for the person to answer that, they have to stop, think, and go to a different memory. And it's almost like a little gear shift, which may give you a little bit of time to think where you might go next with this client, but it may give the client just that little break they need. And I'm going to give you an example of again trying to relate this to ourselves, because I think so much of the work is in our own personal developments that we can relate to. Think about a time that you may have been really thinking about something in the past, what you said, what you did, what they may have thought. And again, we're not talking trauma here. We're just talking everyday things that might cause discomfort within the body. And you kind of caught it, I should have done that. If I'd have just said that, if I'd just have left earlier, we can get caught up in that whole brain process. Well, if the fire alarm in your building suddenly went off and everybody had to evacuate and go outside, you'd probably find that you had an immediate shift in that thinking, and the emotions would change instantly. So you'd hardly be walking down the stairs as the fire alarm's going off thinking, oh wow, yeah, I did say that, and they did think of this, and it all goes immediately. So distraction and attention shifting, Rory, I think it's really powerful. It shouldn't be underestimated. It might sound like a simplistic way of approaching this, but it is really, really powerful.
Yeah, and I think you can't understate that you only use this if the client's becoming distressed, or the client comes and in some cases they are, they're very frightened. They sit and they say, I don't know what to talk about. I've come to talk about things in my past, and I'm unsure where to start. And I think that, sometimes just being very, very gentle and just allowing the flow, because clients don't always disclose what happened to them at the first or even the second meeting. It may take them a lot of courage to be able to tell you exactly what happened. So, you could use it as an introduction to say, look, if you want to just take some time and just go at your own pace, that's fine. And you could introduce things like the neutral topics. So why don't you tell me how you got here? And I think part of it also is a getting to know you exercise. Remember, the person's coming to see a stranger in a strange room, maybe not quite sure what the process of therapy is. And when you've done the contracting, just to show yourself as a human and have a bit of a back and forward, I think goes a long way. It goes a long way, Ken. And certainly in the initial, if somebody cannot sustain talking about what's happened, I think that the grounding techniques as a precursor maybe to therapy is helpful. I know a lot of organisations, things like Women's Refuge, would have pre-therapy, where a lot of it was just teaching them grounding techniques. I've heard of therapists taking colouring books in and dot-to-dot books and all that kind of thing before they've actually got to the therapy. So the person has a toolkit to be able to ground themselves should they become overawed. And I like what you say about the fire alarm. The thing is, with our brain's fire alarm, it genuinely doesn't differentiate between the house burning down or the toast burning. When it goes off, it could go off for any reason at all, and it generates that emergency evacuation procedure. So, if you can imagine yourself, your brain is the house, and all of a sudden the fire alarm goes off, what you would usually do is say, well, what's set it off? And you can see the toast is burning, and you just throw the toast out of the door. At least that's what we do in our house. We hurtle it down the yard, much to the amazement and enjoyment of the neighbours, I can tell you that. And then you open the doors, and you waft out all the smoke, and the fire alarm goes off. But I say the brain doesn't differentiate, so you have to sometimes kind of help the client to be able to regulate themselves, to do literally what I've just said, work out if it's real fear, if the house is burning down, or if it's just a memory that's triggered, a bit like the toast burning can.
100%. So we're going to move on to some different techniques that you might use and where you might use them. And you mentioned, Rory, in that line up to this, you were speaking about how people might do some pre-therapy work or might be given some tools. So we as therapists, even if it's not your modality to give homework or tools, you may, in these kind of cases, give a client a tool. So I'm going to go on to grounding through the body, which is an incredible tool. I did a mindfulness course, and the whole mindfulness course is all about being in the here and now. And the body is used to come into the here and now because it's always with you. It's always with you in the here and now. And this is something that you can give to a client, if it is appropriate, as a gift that they can use in the session with you, but they can also use it outside of the session if they should find themselves becoming really anxious and their minds going back into a certain place and creating those emotions. And through the body, it really is about just noticing where your body is in the here and now. And what do I mean by that? Well, at the moment, I'm sat in my recording studio. I'm sat on a chair, so I can feel the pressure of my body, my buttocks, my legs on the chair. My feet are on the floor, and I can actually feel the floor. Now, these things are invisible to me because I'm doing a podcast with you, Rory, so I'm not really thinking about those. But if I come into the here and now and go, can I feel them? Of course I can feel them. I can feel my body. I can feel my hands. I can feel the back of the chair that I'm sitting against. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually coming into my body and using my body right in the position that I just happened to find myself to be able to ground and come into the moment. And this is really effective, specifically if the mind is racing, emotions are rising. The client can do this exercise themselves. Just stop for a moment and say, where are my feet? Can I feel them? What about the rest of my body? How is it feeling? Even questions like, are my hands sweaty? Am I feeling tension in my neck? Which they may well be. Where is that feeling? Where does it sit within my body? And it's taking it away from the brain being in the there and then, bringing the person into the here and now. And it's a gift that they can take away with them if that is appropriate, Rory.
Absolutely. And, I can't say enough about body movement, because when your body moves, your brain is more active. There's lots of research to show people who move a lot, their brains tend to be more active because obviously the part of the brain that is regulating the movement and the balance and all the other things that brains do, it keeps you occupied. It keeps your attention in one place. So I've even heard therapists who talk about encouraging clients to stamp their feet on the floor or to tap their hands on the sides of a chair, or even walk around to just take executive control of how they feel and bring themselves back to the here and now.
Indeed, Rory. Yes. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is a well-known grounding technique where you might suggest to the client that you invite them to notice 5 things that they can see around the room. So here I can see a microphone in front of me. I can see you, Rory, over there. I can see you. That's 2 things. I can see my lights. I can see out my window. And you get them to list the 5 things that they can see. 4 things that they can hear. If I listen now, I can hear you when you're speaking, Rory. I can hear the fan on my mixing desk. And I really have to pay attention. I need to stop to be able to tune into what I can hear. 3 things that they can feel. Can feel my feet on the floor. Can feel the desk in front of me over here. 2 things that they can smell. And this is an interesting one. You might think, well, I can't really smell anything. But stop now, right now, while you're listening to this, and just concentrate on smell. Can you find 2 things that you can smell right now? And it's a very subtle sense smell, unless it's really intense, like Rory's burning toast that gets thrown down. You need to be present to be able to key into that. And then there's an interesting one. It's one thing that you can taste. And you may think, well, I'm not putting anything in my mouth. How can I taste anything? But even now, just take a moment. What is it that you actually taste in your mouth? For me, I've got almost a metallic taste, almost a bitterness that I can taste right now, Rory. And that's because I've had some coffee this morning. And that's leading to the taste. So that's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding technique. And that is in the handout that we're going to give you, as well as the other grounding techniques, grounding through the body. But I wanted to move on and escalate this slightly, Rory. And I'm going to hand over to you for this when we're speaking about reorientation. And this is where somebody is really lost in the there and then. And we recognize that, and we need to bring them back to the here and now and reorient this person.
Yes, I think if someone gets completely lost, I think as a therapist, I would say, I may even say, I'm Rory, I'm your therapist. You're safe. What's happened to you, the person who's done this to you, isn't here anymore, and be really direct about where they are in the world. I mean, I think in my whole practice experience, which spanned 20 years, I think probably, well, let's talk about the people I've talked to, over the years. And I think probably one or 2 people have said they've had a client that's so lost that they've literally regressed back. And sometimes you have to tell the client the reality of where they are. You have to say, you're in a therapy room. I'm Rory, I'm your therapist, or whatever name you have. And you're safe here. What's happened is in the past. I hear that, but you're safe here. And keep repeating that. And hopefully, in most cases, clients will readjust. They'll hear that and they'll readjust. I have to say, I think if it gets to that point, it's probably gone a little too far. Clients may now have gone over from being kind of unwell or traumatized into maybe a slight psychotic episode where they're completely disconnected. In which case, if someone is completely gone, I would suggest maybe getting medical attention, but that happens so infrequently. But you have to reiterate, that they are in a place of safety. And what I would say, Ken, and I think this is totally important and sometimes incredibly missed, is that this isn't a modality of therapy. This isn't a modality. What it is effectively what Patricia Clarkson, a very famous psychotherapist, called a reparenting or repatriative style, where what you're doing is you're using yourself as a regulatory tool. You are regulated in the therapy room. You're okay. As I say at the end of the podcast, you're grounded and you're safe, yeah? And the client then comes into your orbit of that grounding and safety and then takes away from you that. So it's transmitted to the client. It's a little bit difficult to understand unless it's seen, but it's a little bit, I would say, not wanting to be disrespectful, a little bit if you've got like a child who's very upset and you're the parent or the carer and you come into their orbit and being with you just regulates them. And it's exactly the same technique. It's exactly the same principle. And I think every therapist should know this, because the truth of the matter is that lots of therapists who practice were taught 20th century ideas. That 20th century ideas, work of Rogers, work of Byrne, work of Freud, the list goes on. But trauma and understanding how the brain works in traumatic situations is really a 21st century idea. And I'll reinforce this by saying that Carl Rogers, I think, died in 1987. Post-traumatic stress only went in as a diagnosable difficulty someone might have 2 years before his death. So, Carl Rogers really didn't live to see, or any of the therapists. Byrne died in the 70s, I think. So this is a very 21st century idea. So we shouldn't get too hooked up with modality. This is very, very much about providing that relationship, that soil of a different kind that helps the client stabilize.
Yeah. We're speaking advanced working here. As you mentioned, Rory, this is not your everyday run of the mill. This is not your 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 or disrupt the conversation technique. This is the kind of stuff that is taught on our trauma-informed therapy course. And it's the kind of presentation that you don't hope to see, because it does mean that the person is experiencing a flashback, a severe trauma response, and they're no longer with you in that room. They are actually in that past experiencing those emotions, and it's a horrific thing to go through for that person. And the technique is effective under those conditions. And I wanted to touch on one more, and we've got a lot more in the handout. We've got a whole list of them, but I wanted to touch on one more, and this is around self-soothing through the senses. And I really recognize this, and it resonates with me. If you've listened to our podcast for any length of time, you will know I am proudly autistic. And one of the things I experience from time to time is a shutdown, an autistic shutdown, or I will have times when I find it really difficult to be in a mode. I need comfort. I just can't interact anymore. My senses are just overwhelmed. And it's a horrible place to be. And I use this self-soothing techniques in those conditions, and they are incredibly effective. And they're different for different people. For me, and this is one of the examples in the handout, I listen to music that I know and like, and that I know lifts me. And that can really, really help for me. And there are things like wrapping a blanket around you, just so you feel a sense of security. And I have a weighted blanket, and from time to time I will put the weighted blanket on, because it just adds to that sensory experience that I'm feeling. And this self-soothing through the senses is very effective. And again, it's a tool that you might use in the room if a person becomes incredibly emotional. But it is also a gift that you can give them to take away as well. It is something that they can use themselves. And an example of that is called the butterfly hug. It's a hug that a person gives themselves, crossing their arms across their body and just putting pressure on there, maybe tapping on the chest. And it does a number of things. It kind of gives a feeling, a sensation, but it also gives a comforting feeling as well. So I think that is an important grounding technique that I can certainly relate to, Rory.
Yeah, I quite agree, Cam. For me, it's a walk in the countryside, or putting my hands on stones or rocks. I love that. Or paddling in the water. I've been known to pop my socks off and walking in the water thoughtfully. Where we are, we have lots of reservoirs and places and streams, and just have a paddle. Anything that works, really. It could even be things like listening to music, or smells. Lots of people might use scented candles or anything like that. And whatever works, I think this is the thing. This isn't really a prescription. It's more an invitation for those listening to think about, in terms of yourself, what helps you to stay grounded and stay safe. And maybe if it helps you, it may help the client.
Yeah, nicely said, Rory. There is a handout for this, and I'm just going to give you a takeaway from the end of the handout. It covers a number of techniques that we haven't even discussed here, so it's really worth going and getting it. But the practical and practice reflection of this is grounding is not about forcing the client to calm down, as you just said there, Rory. It's an invite. It's about helping them regain the stability to stay with you in the present moment, connected and feeling emotionally safe. Yeah, and it works best when it is collaborative. It's not us doing to the client, it's collaborative. You're suggesting and you're showing that you have something that may be useful, that they might like to try, and they would then give their permission and say, yeah, I'll try that. It's individual. So what works for me, what works for Rory, when you think about your own grounding techniques that might work for you, it's going to be individual to the client of what works for them, and we can ask and we can gain an understanding of what might work best for them. It's best when it's practiced regularly. So just not out of the blue. So if it's practiced regularly, specifically if you're giving it a gift for the client to take away, if they practice it regularly, it can work really well for them. Use early. So we don't want to wait until the client is lost in the material, in the there and then. We want to intervene before it becomes too overwhelming, so that we don't have to use those really advanced techniques. And it can be integrated into the wider therapeutic and treatment plan, no matter what your modality. And Rory, I think you've covered that beautifully when you mentioned about that what we learn as our core training may not cover this. And I know that's why you actually built the trauma-informed practice course, Rory, because you recognise that it's not taught at the greatest of depth in counselling training.
Well, absolutely. Before I built it, I asked our Facebook group, and if you want to join our Facebook group, just go to Facebook and type in Counselling Tutor. And I did a little poll, and I think I asked a question along the lines of, were you ever taught any trauma-informed practice in your course? And I think that something like 90% of the people who responded hadn't. They hadn't been taught it. And I think that, that is why the course that was built was so popular, because it does fill a gap. And I have to say that, speaking with colleagues and through my own experience, that trauma comes up more than you would expect. And it's not trauma with the big T. So we're not talking about people who are coming from war zones or from disaster zones, or people who've had maybe violence perpetrated towards them, which is trauma. Let's be clear about that. But some people could have trauma because of visit to the dentist, or they could have trauma because of a relationship breakup. Trauma now I think is presenting more and more, and certainly the embodiment of it is something that is being discussed more and more by the general public. So it's not. I wouldn't be surprised that people who now present are now more familiar with what trauma is and may actually say to you, I think I have some form of trauma. So I think it's very useful. And the other thing about this handout, feel free to download it, and you can take bits out of it and you could use it to give to the client. They call fridge therapy. So things like the grounding technique, if they say, well, I might forget, well, you could give them a copy of it and they could stick it on the fridge. Fridge therapy.
Yeah,
perhaps
why not?
Perhaps you should do
I like that. Fridge therapy 101.
Yeah.
So where do you get the handout? Just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab. This is from episode 370. Just find that episode. It's free. Just download it. If you're interested in our trauma-informed practice course, we do an intake every single month for that course. It is always full, so you need to join a waiting list and just register your interest in that. And the reason that we cap it and the reason that it runs once a month is because it is tutor-led. There's a tutor-led element. We don't believe that trauma is something you learn from watching a pile of videos and reading a book. So we do it collaboratively with the learning and then the practice elements of that as well. And if you want more information of that, just go to counsellingtutor.com, and the information is right there on our website. Just click on our products and all our courses are there. And that is today's ethical, sustainable practice. And we now move on to Practice Matters, where Rory, you met up with and interviewed Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith. Tell me more.
Yes, well, I mean, it's quite exciting, really, Ken, because Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith are real luminaries in the world of eating disorder and neurodivergence. And they produced a number of lectures for the Counsellor CPD library. But today we're focusing on a lecture they produced on ARFID, which is Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. It's available in the CPD library, and I caught up with both Bernie and Lisa, and this is what they had to say about it. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith. Bernie and Lisa are doing some fantastic work in the area that's becoming more and more important, the connection between neurodivergence and disordered eating, and how easily this can be misunderstood or missed altogether. They produced a brilliant lecture for the Counsellor CPD library as part of their wider series on disordered eating, and today we're going to be focusing on ARFID, Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. This is a condition that can affect both children and adults and is often dismissed as fussy eating. But today, as you'll hear, ARFID is far more complex than that and can have a significant impact on a person's physical and emotional well-being and indeed daily life. So Bernie and Lisa, a very warm welcome back to the podcast. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, Rory. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, Rory. Very much so.
Now, I've reviewed the lecture that you've done. It's brilliant. It's a really brilliant lecture. People really should be aware of, eating, how people present with eating and disordered eating. But ARFID seems to be widely misunderstood, even amongst professionals. Sometimes it's assumed as picky eating or attention seeking, but it can be more complex. Can you give me a simple definition of what ARFID is and why it matters?
Well, it's a terrifying, very scary, provoking for so many people, Rory. And it makes eating such a trauma, really, unless we actually, and all the sensory issues that go around it, unless we actually deal with all the sort of sensory issues and what's going on behind that and the anxiety. Luckily, we have just this week, January, changed the guidelines now. And we don't necessarily have to, it's not so weight-based as it was before. So the criteria has changed. And what do you think, Lisa?
I think one of you use the word scary thing is, for me, from a nutritional side, is the fact the restriction on the variety of the foods can be so great that the diet is not balanced. It's not giving the body everything it needs. And if we look primarily at feeding the brain, there are key things the brain needs to function optimally. And if it doesn't get that, a stressed brain will sort of default to type, which then makes the restrictive behaviours even more pronounced. So people get then stuck in this sort of cycle. that it's more difficult to try and get the nutrients in because of the ARFID itself, but the ARFID itself is restricting the nutrients that go in, and you just get stuck there with basically a starved brain leading to a starved body.
Yes, and I think that's something that people don't perhaps appreciate. The focus may be on the body issue, but actually the way the brain develops, the brain is an organ that needs to be fed. Bernie, you said that the definitions have changed. Is this a technical definition in terms of diagnosis or something in a diagnostic manual?
It's the diagnostics. Basically saying key principles, the new guidelines. Weight should not be the main factor for accessing support. It makes it clear that BMI or weight alone should not decide whether someone gets help or when they enter or leave treatment. Behavioural signs of concerns from family professionals should instead be used to determine for need. And they're focusing now, Rory, on behavioural signs and early identification. So it's changing. It's still early days, but because it often doesn't present with dramatic weight loss, we often don't take it seriously, which is very typical to so many other eating disorders. The BMI has a huge indicator. That's changed. It's only been very recent. It's only very new, and we don't actually know how it's going to affect adults, because it's more sort of, at the moment, it's going to be great for the young people and adolescents.
Sure. So this is more for maybe medical professionals to take into account Lisa's point about, not just the body shape and the brain. The brain and the whole nutrition piece. And I think that it's really evident that ARFID is an eating disorder, but it's unlike, say, anorexia or bulimia. It's not really driven by body image or weight concerns. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, spot on. It doesn't tend to be. Although even in anorexia nervosa, it's with autistic people, for example, it's not always body weight and shape issues. It's more a lot of sensory issues and a lot of problems that surround that, Rory. So it is different for other eaters, because, as you said quite eloquently, that it's not body related. It's more just fear, anxiety, sensory issues, the driving causes behind it. And it's very real and it's very scary.
Yeah. And I think that I hear sensory issues, my mind is automatically kind of activated to neurodivergence and the fact that some neurodivergent people struggle with sensory issues. I have a grandson who is autistic, and he is very, very triggered by anything that's sensory. Does this particularly, Lisa, affect neurodivergent people, or can it affect a whole cohort of people?
It is predominantly in the neurodivergent, Rory, especially with the autistic, because then we get sort of with the rigidity as well. So once the behaviour has developed, you've got that rigidity and the reluctance for change. And also you've got that hypersensitivity. And if you think of food, it's a multimodal sensory assault in some cases. You've got the colours, you've got the taste, you've got the texture, you've got the smell of there. And also in some instances, you've got the noise, like some people get really hypersensitive to other people eating or crunching, etc. So when you put those together and then we think about what is promoted out there as, a healthy diet. So, and I hasten to say what we should be aiming for is to be fed, fueled and functional. We're not aiming for perfection at all. But when you think of, say, salmon, they're always on about your oily fish. Texture, slimy, no-go. Taste, fishy, no-go. Smell, it's not going to happen. And then we also start building into that the shame and the blame and the self-judgment that comes into it, which, especially from the autistic individual, they'll actually feel a lot more pronounced as well. So it really does get people sort of stuck in this going round and round, it's almost an ever increasing circle of things that get pulled in. That's like a little whirlpool pulling things in that keeps the person stuck where they are.
Yeah. And I suppose there can be some self-blame with that for some people. They may give themselves a very, very hard time. Now, we don't usually use the term disorder on the podcast. But I guess it is known as an eating disorder. But would it be right to think of it as a nervous system adaptation?
I think a stressed body and therefore a stressed nervous system, and if we bring, say, the neurodivergence in there, we have got a potential hypersensitive nervous system, then is going to have an impact. And when we look at how the body responds and recovers from stress, I always say that the brain and the nervous system have to be told things. They don't have eyes and ears, and they're told through experiences, internal, external, what's happening in the body. And if those messages are constantly stressed, anxious, inflammatory, nervous messages, then that's what the nervous system becomes.
Yeah. And of course, with neurodivergent people, some have something called interoception, which is how they feel inside their body, and it creates a lot of signals, can't it, Bernie?
Absolutely. So it can be the heightened dorsal-acute, and of course it could be so intense or so muted. And as you said earlier on, I think you said something about shame and the self-blame. And then the parents get into this very, very sad, quite desperate loop where they're trying so hard to give the children the healthy food, and they're just terrified that their system absolutely totally overloaded, and all they want is bland foods that doesn't give them, as Lisa said, everything they need to feed the brain, the body, and the mind. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. It's really interesting. This is something I see about my grandson. He has very kind of rigid eating patterns, and we do encourage him to eat other things, but it is a bit of a battle, if I'm quite honest, which kind of leads me to the question: how do we, or how do people working in this area shape eating behaviour? What kind of interventions can be useful to help someone gain that healthier diet, while acknowledging, that the interoception, the idea that it might be stressful to eat something?
I think the first thing my baseline I start from is almost an eat what you want and now let's add what you need. So you don't take those safe foods away, Rory, because you're just going to add to stress and anxiety if you do that. And when you look at the senses of food as well, don't change everything all at once. So if you're going to change something, maybe you could look at trying to keep it looking the same, but it is being slightly different. So if we take pasta, for instance, it's a very common food that's eaten. It's bland. It hasn't got the texture issues with chewing, etc. But we can actually look at replacing that with some of the pastas that are made with peas or chickpeas. They're going to look the same, and you don't change it straight away. You just start introducing maybe 20% of that pasta with the normal and slowly expand. Then you look at changing the shape. So if you change one sensory thing at a time, it's a slow process. It isn't done overnight. You can start getting more nutrients in. And then we look at sort of food chaining by doing that. So you might start off with, let's just say a shop bought chicken nuggets. And you slowly look at changing, getting maybe a homemade chicken nugget that looks the same, but then slowly you start to change maybe the shape of it, then take a little bit more of the coating off and then move it. So the end result would be eating a piece of chicken. That's a healthy piece of chicken, not a processed piece of something that's been glued together and had some breadcrumbs on it. So it's about making these small changes whilst keeping the safe foods on the table, because at the end of the day, if somebody's eating pasta, at least they're eating. We're not taking that away. And I think the other thing is exposure. Just have something sitting there on the table. Don't have to eat it. Don't even have to look at it to start off with. And then just slowly move it nearer. It can maybe go on the plate. Still don't have to look at it, but then progress to maybe picking it up, smelling it, have a lick, put it down, put it back in the bin, and just work slowly so the food becomes something that someone can get used to and in itself isn't scary.
Yes, I think that's an interesting point, isn't it? I never thought of food as scary because, it's something that's, pops up on your plate. But I guess for some people, certainly with very strong sensory processing, that it might feel quite scary to eat, I don't know, a chicken nugget or a piece of fish. And I guess that brings me to my next point. People are going to be listening saying, well, this is all right, it's all well and good. But how do we see the signs and symptoms of someone who may have ARFID? What are those kind of signs that we could look out for and kind of take a view on?
I would say you have to be really careful not to sort of define the illness. However, just to keep a really wide eye on that sort of the picky eat is one thing, but when you have ARFID, it's real fear, real anxiety. And what we've got to remember also is when we're working with autistic individuals, or if a child's autistic, they may be so masked, so they look very calm, like a duck swimming underwater. Yeah. So you don't always know. You often don't know that the child is in huge anxiety. So you might say to your child, well, some children I know get really terrified of food. Does that ring true for you? For some kids, that really is scary with that. And I can see that you're looking really fearful what's going on. But I would probably invite anyone who's listening to get support, not to turn it into a battleground, because it can very, very easily. And I work with lots of families that that's happened to through fear, clearly through fear. But I do see the families that seem to get through it in a way, the ones who calm about it. It's almost like you can have you can have it properly after you've had your ice cream. So it's like not making a big thing about having treats, and you can have your pudding and your ice cream after you've eaten that.
Yes.
And that's really, really important, because it is, because of course a lot of ARFID people like Rory, it's going to be the high sugars, the high refined foods. So that's a given. And of course then they're sedating themselves and calming themselves, and it feels good. But then they can get into a real way of living. And I've got to know lots of people that actually happen very much too. They always get reliant on those foods because they're safe and they feel safe and they taste safe.
And I think one other thing is to bear in mind, high anxiety often manifests itself in the gut. So we can get a lot of nausea, a lot of stomach aches, a lot of things like that actually then prevent the food being introduced even more. Because I don't want a new food, it might make me feel sick. And if there's a fear of being sick, or I don't want a new food, it gives me tummy ache. I see a lot of clients with restrictive sort of lack of variety in the diet that complain about digestive issues. So that also then just manifests into the ARFID.
Yeah.
And that's leading on to that, Lisa, it's really important we don't force feed the kids and turn it into a real battle. Something about curiosity, interest, sort of gentleness. And I know that is in an ideal world, and for people who have got 2-3 children at home after work and getting the school homework done, you just want to feed them and get them to bed, and I get that. But then we can make the long-term issues so much worse.
Yeah, so I know in my grandson that we introduced healthy food to him. He's rather, shall we say, a kind of a very excited eater, and he eats with his hands, and he may at some point launch food across the kitchen if it's often had a sausage fly past my ear or a piece of fruit stick to the wall, and we try to introduce things, and sometimes he'll take a bite and he will kind of make a face. Other times you can see him try to reach for it and then try it again and then push it away. So it is really I think it's a game of patience as well as, thinking about the nutrition. But I'm guessing that, maybe for children and for older people, there can be psychological and social impacts of ARFID.
Absolutely. Just going out for dinner, lunch, is excruciating. It's hard going into school, school diner. it's difficult. So that, yeah, you're right. Really, really hard, actually, Rory. Can be excruciating.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess there's emotional consequences that build up over time. So those things in childhood usually present in adulthood when people come for therapy.
Exactly.
And actually, in adulthood, it's a little bit harder to work with from my perspective, Rory, because with a child, you've got a parent preparing the meals. But when you're dealing with an adult who's preparing their own meals, they've actually got to go to the supermarket and buy this food that they've got a big aversion to and prepare it and it's really is a little bit more challenging, especially because the behaviours have been so ingrained since childhood.
Yes,
very ingrained, always there.
Yes, it's quite interesting. I mean, I'm 68 at the time this is going to be released, and I can think that the messages that I got from my parents were, clear your plate. In the war, we didn't have food, and then we went into saying the starving children who'd love that food, which I'm sure is true. I'm not diminishing famine in countries, but if you're forced to eat food that you don't like on the premise that somebody in another country might want it, it can have an emotional impact, can't it?
Why did you have that one, Rory? I had the children in Ethiopia.
Yes,
and you really sort of signed up memories of myself and my sister. I would say what may be considered ARFID when she was younger.
Yeah.
She did Bowsville, grow into whatever else, but she was absolutely very, very afraid of food. And it was a really big, big issue for her. And my father was an absolute tyrant as far as eat everything on your plate. And if you didn't eat, you get it back. You get it back to food.
Yeah.
So it was fascinating because what happened in that family situation was that my sister was so scared. She put her food onto my plate, and I ate it. So I ended up getting sort of a binge eating problem, not overeating.
Yes. Yeah.
And she was undereating. So it's just that one dynamics of one sister helping another out can cause all sorts of problems within a family unit.
Yeah.
And just thinking what you're saying there, Bernie, about if you don't eat it, you're going to have it the next day. The anxiety then never goes because oh God, I didn't eat that. I'm going to get it for my next meal. And it's there all the time. Not only that, then you've got somebody that isn't eating, they're not getting the nutrients.
Yeah.
So, all of these sort of food scripts we've got and behaviours we take with us. And of course, if you're dealing with somebody who's an adult with ARFID, I have one gentleman, and the only way we can get vegetables into him is through baby pouches. The vegetable baby, he doesn't have to see it then. It's all in a mush. There's no texture to it. It doesn't really have to smell it because he eats it from the pouch, sort of just like squeeze. And that's the only way, because he has never eaten a vegetable except peas in his life. And he was in his late 50s.
Wow.
Well done, you, Lisa, that you've actually got that to happen.
Yeah. And this is where we've got to lose those food rules.
Yeah.
And I'm saying to Ben, we've got too many food rules. We need to lose them and relax a little bit about food, so that if you've got some, a child that will only eat their meal if they're watching their iPad, is that in the scale of things really such an issue? Yeah. If they can have their iPad, get distracted and eat the food, even if it's with their fingers, great, as opposed to let's have a battle at the dinner table.
Yeah.
Yes, and I've watched that. One of my very best friends, her son, when he's in his 40s now, but he would only eat bread buns, bread rolls. That was all he'd eat, and pizzas. And I was quite horrified at the time because I was very into healthy eating. Oh, and by the way, I must remind parents to watch the word healthy. I would probably use the word nourishing. Yes. But she was a nurse, so she used to give him vitamins, and she was so laid back about it that I always had another friend who was very anxious. My friend's son went on to eat absolutely everything he was given, and my other friend's son has still got an eating issue today. So it is how we deal with it when they're younger. It's not our fault, but obviously anxiety can make us overact and over worry.
If there was one thing you'd want every counsellor listening to remember about ARFID, what would it be?
I don't think mine's one thing to remember. I think mine would be one tip. when you're dealing with ARFID is don't introduce a new food at mealtimes.
Yes.
Because if you do at mealtime and it gets rejected, you run the risk of the entire meal being rejected. Introduce it outside of mealtime, because then even if it is that plate of pasta, at least they're eating it, as opposed to that being rejected as well.
And in a non-threatening way, calm environment. And I mean, and to avoid for some families, obviously, food can be the currency of love. We really want to give our children the best. But sometimes when it's so important to us, it becomes less important to children. And I've seen many children use it as tools against their parents as they get older. Well, I know she loves me eating her home food, so I'm not going to damn well cook it when I'm 13. Eat it. Somebody eat it.
Yeah, so I guess the message is that less kind of rigidity around food, be creative, and realise that everybody has their own kind of taste. ARFID, Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, a lecture, is available in the Counsellor CPD library now, and it just remains for me to say, Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith, thank you for joining us.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counselor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com. Thank you very much to Bernie Wright, Lisa Smith, and to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions. And we now move into student services, and I'm excited today because we've got our roving reporter on the ground, which is Paul Cullen. But we're talking first about finding your first supervisor, Rory.
Yes, it's always a bit of a quest, isn't it, Ken? When you get your fitness to practice letter, and your tutor says you've got to find yourself a supervisor. Where do you start? Who do you look for? What do you need as a supervisor? Now, hopefully some of that will be covered in class. Reason for supervision, the kind of supervisor you should be looking for. They may have even a list of approved supervisors. Your training organisation may have a list of approved supervisors, which is usually the case. But, what do you look for in your first supervisor? And I think it's an interesting conversation. I can remember the quest I went on, and I made this really clear in my book about my first supervisor, who I referred to as being a little bit like paint stripper, and I enjoyed the very robust conversations that we had in my early career. Because I came from a completely different background than a lot of my peers. I came from a commercial background where a lot of my peers had worked in, say, education or nursing or social work. So my first supervisor had a bit to do to get me kind of squared up, as my dad used to say, and get me ready to go. And I'm kind of like that anyway. I like to be challenged. So I think the first position is, what kind of person would you want to be able to say to that you feel like maybe you've made a mistake or you've got it wrong. It's no good having a supervisor where you cannot bring the totality of your practice to them. And by I mean the totality, I mean every client you have, and also to talk about what went right and, crucially, what you believe went wrong. Because if you don't look at the stuff that didn't go right, there's absolutely no value in supervision, in my view. And I think, it's a think, it's not a feel, I think that, you need to find someone who you feel comfortable talking about the totality of your practice. So I think that's a starting point. And sometimes, it's supervisors are like therapists, Ken. Sometimes they can be the nicest people in the world, well qualified, and you sit in front of them and you're thinking, I'm just not getting it. I just don't feel it. You know what I mean? And you might say, okay, well, thank you for your time. A lot of supervisors will give you, say, half an hour free or half an hour to low cost. And it's no reflection on the supervisor. It's a relationship at the end of the day. And a good relationship has to be in place. And it's okay to sit in front of someone and think, yeah, they're lovely people, but I just don't, I'm not getting the vibe, Yep. In which case, go and find somebody where you are getting the vibe. Yeah.
I think that you're being sold short if supervision is a chat and a cup of tea with a friendly colleague, because that's not what supervision is. And Rory, you beautifully introduced this by saying you're going to have the learning from your training of what supervision is and what you should be looking for. And when you go out and choose your first supervisor, you don't have the range or pick of any supervisor, because you're going to be looking for, there's a bit of housekeeping. You're going to be looking for a supervisor who will work with you as a placement trainee counsellor, who understands your modality and supervises you within that modality. So those are a starting point that would understand how you are working. So maybe part of your placement might be online working. Well, you would be expected to have a supervisor who could hold you with your face-to-face work and your online, and would understand that and be able to supervise it fully for you. But once those boxes have been ticked, I'm going to go to what you've said, Rory, as the most important thing is the relationship. And it's the same with counselling. When you're out and you are a counsellor and you're working, not every client that contacts you or has an introductory session with you is going to end up working with you, and quite rightly so, because I know I'm not a fit for every client in the world, and it's no bad reflection on me if a client meets with me and goes, you know what, this is not the person for me, I'm going to go somewhere else. In fact, I'm very grateful for them, because if they did go down the road with me, they wouldn't be being their true selves if they had that reservation within them. And the same is true of you. So here's the thing. I've said this a number of times over the years on this podcast. The moment you see your first placement client, you sit in that room, they walk in and you sit down and you speak to them. It's your practice. It's your practice. And your supervisor oversees your practice. So you want your supervisor to reflect how you want your practice to look. And that's going to be different for different people. So when I was looking for a supervisor, first thing I did was didn't just go to the first one at the top of the recommended supervisor list that was provided by my learning provider. I went and spoke to a few on the phone. Back in those days, there wasn't any Zoom. I don't even think Skype was around then.
Did we have lights and carpet in those days, Ken?
Running water and everything.
Yeah.
So at first, I spoke to a number of different supervisors. After speaking to, I think, 3 supervisors, I decided that I felt more comfortable with a female supervisor, not a male supervisor. And I don't know what that was. It was just something within me, and that was a preference of mine. But what I then did was I had an introductory session with, I think, two supervisors when I narrowed it down. And I asked them questions about them, the way that they supervise. And I asked questions, if I think back now, I asked questions like, well, I'm studying person-centered therapy. How will you help me understand how the theory that I'm learning in my formal training is actually playing out in my sessions, in my placement sessions with my client? And I did that because I'd already had a brief of what assignments I was going to be writing, and one of them was, how has your supervision impacted the way that you practice your modality? So I wanted to get that right, but that was just me personally. So I think that the relationship, you're 100% right, Rory, is most important when you're training someone you feel comfortable with and confident to say when you feel you're getting it wrong, when you feel you messed up, to take your frustrations. The client didn't arrive. There's this preconceived notion that counselors are all beauty and light, and we're just real people. And when I had do not arrive after do not arrive after do not arrive in my sessions, I was getting frustrated. I was getting frustrated. And if you think about it, that frustration was, almost at a client that they didn't arrive. I was here and I was disappointed, and I was able to take that into supervision without feeling shame, because you can't think that way about someone else, and work through all of those emotions, all of those first step emotions going into practice. Now, there's nobody better, Rory, than Paul to speak about this. He is a clinical supervisor, as are you, Rory, as am I, but more so, Paul actually teaches on our clinical supervision training course. So he's there at the front line training supervisors. So I know he has got a real good understanding of this from a number of different perspectives. But before we hand over to Paul to kind of do his intrepid reporting, any thoughts, Rory, before we hand over?
Yes, before I get any letters in the postbag about, not challenging students because they don't be challenged in supervision. I think that, if you go and see a supervisor and you feel it's kind of not right, maybe worth chatting to a peer and finding out why it's not right. Because what we don't want, absolutely don't want, is the tea in the chat supervision. What we want is work done, reflection undertaken, learning, a learning process. And I think that, should you meet a supervisor and you think, well, it's just not happening for me, after all I've said earlier in this discussion, might be worth going away and talking to a parent and think, well, why isn't it working? Where's the fear? What is it that is putting me off? And it might be that once you've talked it through, you think, actually, perhaps that might be the person for me. But the best person, as you said, is Paul Cullen. He's joining us now to talk about his view on these things.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Hello, Paul. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you, Rory. And yourself?
Yeah, and thank you for joining us today. And of course, you're our kind of our supervision guru as you teach on our supervision, the Counselling Tutor Supervision course. And I think it's an interesting question. Choosing a supervisor. It can be quite a daunting thing if you're choosing your first supervisor. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what I've realised now more so, I guess, as I've become a supervisor, as I trained and qualified as a supervisor, I'd put a lot more kind of thought into. I think it's become more difficult to think about choosing a supervisor. When I came back into practice, and that was after a number of years away from counselling, and I was stepping back into practice. I was almost like sitting back in the chair again after quite a period of time away from it, and I wanted to get a supervisor. I went with who's closest, and that was the kind of who's a qualified supervisor and who's the closest. And I remember having the conversation with my supervisor and said, so I'm wondering why did you choose me? I said, well, you were the nearest.
Yeah.
And it was that simple. That would be very different now. I'd be looking for something that would, on the surface, look more challenging. That someone who knows more about online, because I work online. So I'd be wanting someone who has a good understanding of working online and some of the challenges of working online, some of the risks around working online. I think I'd be putting a lot more thought into it than what I initially did, which was just based on geographical location.
Yeah, and I think you wouldn't be on your own. I think that cost and proximity, because, I was a student and I can remember having to leverage every single minute of my time to fit my work commitments, my home commitments, my college. I went to college commitments, and that included supervision, my practice. It was 2 years of literally making time bend, and I can remember thinking to myself, I got a supervisor who was near me, and that was helpful. And she gave me student rates, which is always helpful. And it worked very well. And I stayed with her for some time. But I do think that sometimes the supervisor you start with, say, at your student level, may not be the supervisor for your ongoing journey. I don't know if that's something you've identified, Paul.
Absolutely. I do think, and I think it's interesting. I do encourage my supervisees. I do in my contract. I say, to consider, speaking to me if you're thinking about looking for another supervisor. And I encourage you to look for another supervisor, after a period of time. I think it's good to continually kind of challenge ourselves. I was thinking about when you kind of mentioned about wanting to talk about this topic about maybe changing supervisors. And I was thinking, I hear people saying, I read about it in forums, people say, I really like my supervisor, or I love my supervisor. I hear that language spoken about. And I think, is that a time to maybe kind of consider, am I feeling too comfortable with my supervisor? Because it was something that occurred to me yesterday when I was pondering on it. I don't want to feel too comfortable with my supervisor. I want to get that balance of feeling a little bit apprehensive and a little bit uncomfortable with my supervisor, because I think it's the role of the supervisor to kind of to push and to challenge me so that I'm not always in my safe zone. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think you've hit on something here, Paul. Growth doesn't come from an easy life. It comes from being challenged. And sometimes, certainly in my supervision, my supervisor would challenge me, and it's uncomfortable and it's not nice. And you go away and you think, well, that was tough. I mean, my first supervisor in my book, I mentioned that she was a bit like Nitromors, paint stripper, and he'd go in and he'd come away and you'd think, oh my goodness. But boy, oh boy, did she do a good job, I think, kind of getting a raw recruit, a rookie, into a semblance of a practitioner. I think she saw what she was working with and thought, we're going to have a bit of a boot camp here, maybe, and get this person, ready for practice. You've alluded to online and telephone working, which I think is important. Is there any other element of choosing a supervisor as a student that you would kind of promote? And I'm thinking here of, if you're training as a person-centred therapist, would you look for a person-centred supervisor? Yeah. So why is that?
Well, again, it's having that understanding of the modality, and that, how, I use the seven-eyed model of supervision. Is the model that I kind of work with as a supervisor. And so being able to explore the relationship, being able to explore interventions that are being used, if as a supervisor I'm unfamiliar with that particular modality, or I don't have a deep kind of grounding in the theory and the practice of that modality, then I'm not going to be able to support the students in the same way. So, yeah, I would really kind of encourage students to think about a supervisor that has a real kind of clear understanding about the modality that you're receiving your training in, to ensure that it's a real good fit.
Yeah, because I've always...
it's important.
I agree, and I think that, supervision, certainly if you're a kind of diploma and above, maybe anything where you're client-facing, your supervisor should be the mortar in between the bricks. So you go to your training provider and they provide the structure of the course and, the bricks, if you like. They tell you about the theories and there might be some work. But I think supervision is the mortar, that kind of...
I like that.
That kind of finishes off you as a practitioner. It makes you sturdy. If you've ever stacked bricks up and hope that you're going to build a house with it without actually using mortar, you're going to be in a bit of trouble come any wind or any kind of snow, aren't you? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the glue in between, isn't it, that's kind of holding that structure together and really kind of, like I said, it cements that structure. And I think, it was good for me as an emerging supervisor at the time when I started to get my first few students who were training in person-centred. That was a real good kind of push for me because it'd been a long time since I'd explored theory. So I had to dive right back into theory and, to kind of get that firmer understanding that I used to hold quite freely in my head because I knew that that's where they were at their level and that their understanding of theoretical principles within that modality would be really quite sharp. So I needed to go and sharpen mine up and that to ensure that I could be that adequate cement, that adequate mortar.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think that, as I don't supervise anymore, but when I did, I spent a lot of my time just researching the changes in our profession. There are so many changes now in our profession that are coming more rapidly than I can remember. I mean, the latest one, and we'll be talking on a podcast to a rather an expert on this, is the new guidance from the English government. I'm very precise about this because it is an English government directive that they're not going to be police will not be routinely asking for client notes. And I think you have to be really on top of the changes, and they're coming thick and fast, really. So I think if I was looking for a supervisor, I might be asking the question, can you tell me any changes of legislation recently? And see what they say.
Yeah, see if there's a look of shock and horror on their face, and but again, I think this is the role of the supervisor now is to be aware of so much more than maybe would have been expected of supervision before, and that around legislation, or around the use of. We talk about, artificial intelligence. I see it on the Facebook page. Yeah. I think as supervisors, we need to have a really good understanding around that. This increasing work of working online, having an understanding of the elements of disinhibition, not just client disinhibition, but practitioner disinhibition. Yep. I think these are all elements that the supervisor needs to be really skilled and knowledgeable about. And again, keeping up with the ongoing kind of research and changes in legislation, in various kind of bits of research. It's a task, and there's an accountability around that. So I think when a student is looking for a supervisor, they need to be coming with their questions. What can you offer? Can you offer me this? Are you able to support me in this?
Yeah, I think so. And also, I think something to remember here, Paul, is that you are, if you're a supervisee, you're effectively a paying customer.
Absolutely.
You're taking your hard-earned cash or whatever you use now to pay, live in the electronic world, and you're paying a fee for professional services. And I think that you should be asking the tough questions, such as, what recent changes in legislation. What's your understanding of data protection? All that type of thing. Because that's the whole point of being a supervisor. You're further on down the road. You should be on top of this. And, I know that you and I always took it really, really seriously. That is the nature of the work. Before we move on, there's just one final point about supervision, and I just wanted to get your view on it. I see a lot of posts where to get a placement, you have to have you have to buy the supervision of the placement. What your thoughts are on that?
It's an additional cost. And that, we talk about, and I read a lot of similar posts as you do, Rory, and I hear a lot of people talking about the financial difficulty it is in getting trained. And again, if you're having to buy the supervision, so you've got a placement and the supervision that you've got to pay for in-house, I'd be curious about that. And I was reading a post recently where they had to pay for the supervision that was in-house and they couldn't have another supervisor. And again, that bothers me in that, because then it's about freedom of choice. Then you're being assigned a supervisor that isn't necessarily a good fit for you. Again, thinking about the modality and that we've just spoken about, how confident are we that supervisor that you're being assigned is of a similar modality of yours?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that. That doesn't feel. I'd have really struggled with that, when I was in practice. If I was being assigned a supervisor and it wasn't necessarily a good fit and I couldn't go elsewhere.
Yeah, and to provide a bit of balance on that, because we haven't got agencies here to defend themselves.
Yeah,
I would say that it wouldn't be unusual if you worked in a, say for the NHS, or you work for an organisation, you may very well be assigned a supervisor. I know lots of people who work for organisations who get assigned a supervisor, and I'm sure that there are agencies who have excellent supervision, but as you rightly say, it does speak to autonomy. And I guess someone who's looking for a placement and a supervisor, they're going to have to make that choice. I don't think it's particularly good or bad, but I think it's something to consider. Do you want to choose your supervisor based on what we talked about, or do you want to be appointed a supervisor? And I think that's the thing. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you, Paul. I know that you bring a wealth of knowledge when it comes to supervision. And with that, back to you, Ken.
Massive thank you to Paul. Always lovely to hear from you. And thank you, Rory, for having that all-important discussion. And that brings us to the end of student services for today. But it also brings us to the end of episode 370 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
It does, Ken. And we started off with ethical and sustainable practice. And we talked about grounding techniques every counsellor should know. That's a free handout. It's available for you now. Just go to counsellingtutor.com, hit the podcast tab, go to episode 370, click on the link, and that podcast will end up in your mailbox. Moving on from that, practice matters. I think an important interview with Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith, who talked about ARFID, Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. It's one of a number of lectures that both Bernie and Lisa have delivered for the Counsellor CPD Library on eating and also neurodivergence. It's a whole series, and I think really, really useful and I would dare say essential watching. And then in student services, finding your first supervisor, that quest, that very first journey of significance that you move along in your training and gain your supervisor, which is really the gateway to becoming a practitioner, to actually getting into the work. As always, we like to thank Paul Cullen for his insights. He's our external correspondent and a tutor on our supervision course. And thank you for your likes and subscribes and shares. And as always, and until the next time, stay grounded and stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.